let's talk about The Grapes of Wrath. The Grapes of Wrath was written in 1939 and won the Pulitzer Prize and also the National Book Award in 1940. There's one other video on my channel that has those two accolades, and that is Bernard Malamud's The Fixer. But about The Grapes of Wrath, the setting, it begins in Oklahoma, where the Dust Bowl has wiped out croplands for thousands of farmers. And the Dust Bowl was a time in the 1930s when dust storms in the central U.S. led to a lot of food shortages and drought, essentially. Because farmers had no way of making money, the banks started repossessing their lands, and then farming corporations would come in and buy up the land in order to develop it with more large-scale corporate farming practices. So again, this is set in the 1930s, so that probably just looked like larger, more industrial tractors instead of people tilling the soil by hand. But the Joad family is affected by this in The Grapes of Wrath, and they have no choice but to pack up and head west to California. They want to go to California because there's talks of jobs out there, especially more farming jobs. Most of the novel is their trip west. So the case could be made that this is kind of an adventure novel to the likes of The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, but I think that the stakes are much higher in this case. It's a family basically fighting for survival, a family that during their journey have to deal with death and not having enough food to eat, and with pregnancy. It seems like every other chapter in this book steps away from the Joad family in order to describe one or two different things. The first thing is kind of the landscapes of the U.S. In the gray sky, a red sun appeared, a dim red circle that gave a little light, like dusk. And as that day advanced, the dusk slipped back towards the darkness, and the wind cried and whimpered over the fallen corn. The other thing that he devotes every other chapter to is descriptions of exploitation that's happening in the society. So it's chapter 7 in the book. It's a really evocative portrait of what's going on a used car lot. It takes the perspective of the salesperson who is essentially selling families the worst product he can at the highest price. And I think that there are a few reasons why Steinbeck did this. Number one, I think that he's trying to capture an image of place in general. He is a quite straightforward describer of place, and one that I do think writers today should study a bit more. Number two is that always a part of these descriptions is a sense of desolation. There's talk of hundreds of empty houses during those chapters about the landscape. There's talk of the climate in Middle America that makes stepping foot in that place seem kind of harrowing. And the third reason why Steinbeck does this, I think it's a reminder of what things were like before exploitation of people and of the land started happening. There's something very unnatural and kind of depressing about the system of making money at the expense of others. And number four, he's showing a realistic portrayal of how poor or disenfranchised people were treated. This last reason is one that I think resonates the most with people today. And while I was reading, I felt like the novel could have been written in 2016 rather than 1939. There's just so many parallels with contemporary society and the political climate around immigrants and the poor. And just that fact alone, I think, is reason to put this book at the top of your reading list. In the West, there was panic when the migrants multiplied on the highways. Men of property were terrified for their property. Men who had never been hungry saw the eyes of the hungry. Men who had never wanted anything very much saw the flare of want in the eyes of the migrants. And the men of the towns and of the soft suburban country gathered to defend themselves, and they reassured themselves that they were good and the invaders were bad, as a man must do before he fights. They said, "These Okies are dirty and ignorant. They're degenerate, sexual maniacs. These Okies are thieves. They steal anything. They've got no sense of property rights." And the latter was true, for how can a man without property know the ache of ownership? And the defending people said, "They bring disease, they're filthy. We can't have them in the schools. They're strangers. How'd you like to have your sister go out with one of them?" The local people whipped themselves into a mold of cruelty. They formed units, squads, and armed themselves, armed with clubs, with gas, with guns. "We own the country. We can't let these Okies get out of hand." And the men who were alarmed did not own the land, but they thought they did. And the clerks who drilled at night owned nothing, and the little storekeepers possessed only a drawerful of debts. But even a debt is something. Even a job is something. The clerk thought, "I get $15 a week. Suppose a Okie would work for 12. And the little storekeeper thought, "How could I compete with a debtless man?" And the migrants streamed in on the highways, and their hunger was in their eyes, and their need was in their eyes. They had no argument, no system, nothing but numbers and their needs. When there was work for a man, 10 men fought for it, fought for a low wage. "If that fellow'll work for 30 cents, I'll work for 25. If he takes 25, I'll take 20. One of my favorite passages is when Mama Jode goes to a small supermarket to buy groceries for their dinner, and she ends up needing a few more cents for the essentials that they need than she has in her pocket. She tries to talk the grocer into giving her the food for the money that she has. She started for the door, and when she reached it, she turned around. "I'm learning one thing good," she said, "learning it all the time, every day. If you're in trouble or hurt or need, go to poor people. They're the only ones that'll help. The only ones." The screen door slammed behind her. So the Jodes do make it to California, but the work is not as great as they thought it would be. The farms are either filled up with people who want jobs, or the work has been devalued and people who are picking apples or peaches aren't even making enough money to live on. And as the family reaches a farm, for example, they witness a workers' strike going on. And they inquire how much that particular farm pays. And when they get their answer, they realize that if they agree to it, they're kind of doing the hundreds of strikers a disservice. Basically, it will prove to the farming company that people are willing to work for less, and the head honchos don't need to worry about raising their workers' pay or listening to the complaints of people about working conditions. The end of the book is really fascinating, and there might be some spoilers in here, but the Jodes' world is essentially falling apart as a rainstorm comes that halts all their work. There's considerable flooding that traps and kills many people, and the family has no choice but to seek other shelter. It's fascinating because at the end of the book, there are a bunch of parallels to biblical stories. One of the characters has a stillborn baby, and they end up wrapping the baby up and putting it in a basket and floating it down the flooding stream. The very fact that there is a flood that's destroying everything is biblical. And the final image of the book resembles a mature maternal figure holding a suffering man whose demise is a form of martyrdom. It's a symbol that something in the society is very wrong and the system is in need of redemption. About a month ago, I reviewed a novel that's been somewhat forgotten, and that was Ernest Poole's The Harbor. And that novel was labeled as one of the first American socialist novels. And if you watch my review, you can listen to the fact that I kind of disagree with that label. But I do think The Grapes of Wrath is kind of similar to The Harbor. It's much more realistic, though, because it's told from the perspective of the workers, rather than someone who's on the outside looking in. The Grapes of Wrath goes further than The Harbor even, because It makes us see how change and progress, and I'll put progress in quotes, affects the lower classes, so people that we might call blue collar today. It affects them on a much more personal and less journalistic level. So like I said, a lot of these topics are extremely timely and important today. So that's all the more reason to go read The Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck.